Hello, I'm David and I'm a volunteer at Whitchurch Museum and Archives, and welcome to International Activity in Whitchurch in the Second World War. This timeline shows that there was international activity going on in Whitchurch and its surrounding areas for the entire duration of the Second World War. Highlights include the Czechoslovakian army arriving at Cholmondeley Castle in 1940, an Italian prisoner of war camp opening at Prees Heath in 1941, and the Americans arriving in 1944. Czechoslovakia. During the fall of France, the Czechoslovakian resistance fled from Bordeaux to Britain. The leaders formed the Czechoslovakian government in exile, which was recognized by the Allied forces. The resistance also included a brigade of Czech troops, who for the second half of 1940 resided at Cholmondeley Castle. Also in the resistance were some former school teachers who pushed the Czechoslovakian government in exile to make a state school for the children of the Czech refugees and resistance members. The Czechoslovakian government in exile wasn't well regarded by all of the soldiers in the brigade. Amongst them were some communists who had contacted the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia organisers in London and thus mounted a campaign amongst the troops. They stated that they were looking at leaving. The commanders moved first and separated out those who wouldn't follow orders and let them pick their own officers for a series of talks. Dr. Bene, the Czechoslovakian leader, came to try and dissuade them from their plans, but was unsuccessful, and so the 539 mutineers were handed over to the British and moved to an internment camp at Oswestry. The first Czechoslovakian state school was in Camberley in 1940, but it soon moved to Hinton Old Hall near Whitchurch in 1941. The number of pupils increased beyond the size of Hinton Old Hall, and so the juniors were eventually transferred to Maceven Hall near Malpas in 1942. In 1943, the senior school transferred from Hinton Old Hall to Abnant Lake Hotel. The school was also used for the Czechoslovakian Army's officer exams. The move to Abnant Lake Hotel was mainly caused by the continuing disrepair of the building, including the dining hall's ceiling falling in during lunch. Alongside refugee children and children of the members of the Czechoslovakian army at Cholmondeley, there were also several pupils who were the children of the government officials of the Czechoslovakian government in exile. There were also some pupils from the Kindertransport. Several of these pupils went on to be very successful. These include Dr. Pavel Seifter, the Czech ambassador to London from 1997 to 2003, Edvard Utrata, the Deputy Speaker of the Czech Senate, and Lady Milena Grenfell-Baines. The many uses of Prees Heath. In 1939, refugees from the war had their status changed from being an alien to an enemy alien. They were called before a tribunal and categorized as A, B, or C, where A was for Nazis and they were interned, B was for doubtful loyalty and they were supervised, and C was safe and they were free. After the Norwegian campaign failed, a wave of panic about spies amongst refugees meant the government had to take action. This action was the internment of almost all enemy aliens, almost 90,000 people in the end. These internees had to go somewhere, but there wasn't time to build anywhere on such short notice. So while the building and organising of the full camps was going on, most were sent to temporary transportation camps. These camps included warehouses and requisitioned land. Prees Heath was one of those sites. Prees opened in May or June of 1940, and the conditions were very, very poor. Some improvements were made by mid-July when a rabbi came to see the site for a report by the Chief Rabbi's Council. The next slide shows his comments on Prees. As we can see from this report, the conditions were very primitive. There were no houses or huts and just tents. The camp hospital was also in a tent. Most of the men aged over 50 had, after a few weeks, been transferred to Huyton because of the difficult conditions at Prees. The daily sick parade was considerable, and in rainy weather there was much hardship, especially during the lengthy roll call in the morning in the open. Yet every effort was apparently being made to alleviate suffering. Games and music were encouraged, and newspapers were provided. The camp, containing about 1,000 men, was also able to make requests to the officers to go into Whitchurch to purchase requirements for individual internees, and a cooperative benevolent fund was also set up for the benefit of the destitute ones. Some arrangements were made for kosher food, and a canteen store where men could purchase additional food and comforts was arranged. After 5 to 6 months, the camp was closed, and the internees were transferred to the Isle of Man. The facilities on the island were much improved on what they'd had at the transportation camps, but it would take even more time before families could actually meet each other for extended periods. At Prees Heath, 2 boys, Peter Skidloff and Norbert Brainin, formed a friendship over their love of the violin. In the Isle of Man, they met another violin player, Siegmund Nissel. A few years after their release, they met a cellist named Martin Lovett, and the Amadeus Quartet was formed. The camp then became an Italian prisoner of war camp until 1942. Local farmers could hire out the Italian prisoners to help on their farms. This image is an invoice for the hiring of Italian prisoners of war at a farm near Whitchurch. The money is to be paid to the finance office of the Cheshire War Agricultural Executive Committee at Prees Heath near Nantwich. In 1942, Prees Heath resumed part of its activities from the First World War by becoming an airfield. It was known as RAF Whitchurch Heath. It was mainly used as a training site for the pilots. Pilots from Allied nations were stationed at both RAF Tilstock and RAF Hawarden. There were confirmed postings of Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders. In 1943, the airfield was renamed as RAF Tilstock. Most of the information on who was there is from reports on air crashes, due to it being too recent for full records to be released to unrelated parties. RAF Tilstock became redundant in 1946, but its next step is later in the video. Operation Bolero. America prepares for the war in Europe. Operation Bolero started in 1941 and was the build-up of US troops in Britain in preparation of attacking continental Europe, known as Operation Roundup, in 1943. Unfortunately, in 1943 it was suspended as North Africa became a possible staging post for an attack on southern Europe, known as Operation Torch. In the end, Operation Bolero was a committee of American and British logistic officers, and its plans on housing 1,147,000 American troops. The work of the committee later became the province of the Operation Overlord planners. Though Operation Bolero didn't truly meet its actual goal, it still set up the building of a lot of the needed infrastructure. Under the original plans, it was contemplated that groups of hospitals would be set up at Cirencester, Malvern and Whitchurch, and they would operate under hospital centres. The hospitals were built around those 3 locations, but the command posts were only actually built at Cirencester and Malvern. Whitchurch was classed as a provisional unit until it actually got a hospital centre later on in the war. Whitchurch was chosen because it had large tracts of land with individual owners nearby, such as Cholmondeley Castle, Iscoyd Park, Ockley Park and Penley Hall, and this was much easier to requisition. It also had very good rail links, with the Crewe and Shrewsbury Main Line, the Cambrian Line and the Whitchurch-Chester Branch Line, which could provide disembarkation stations nearer the hospitals. It was also not a major bombing target. Here we can see injured American troops disembarking from a hospital train at Malpas Station. These troops would be heading towards Iscoyd. Whitchurch was known as the 804th Hospital Centre. It was opened in June 1944 and had previously been designated the 6810th Hospital Centre Provisional. It comprised of the 57th Field Hospital, the 68th General Hospital, the 82nd General Hospital, the 83rd General Hospital, the 109th General Hospital, the 129th General Hospital, the 137th General Hospital, the 157th General Hospital, the 182nd General Hospital, the 10th Station Hospital, the 33rd Station Hospital, the 36th Station Hospital, the 168th Station Hospital, the 312th Station Hospital, and the 316th Station Hospital. This video will mainly focus on the 82nd, the 83rd, and the 129th General Hospitals. The Whitchurch Hospital Centre was based out of the Whitchurch Secondary Modern School, also known as the Brothel School. It was built to replace a condemned school, but before the pupils could move in, it was requisitioned by the army. The pupils eventually moved in shortly after the war. The 82nd General Hospital at Iscoyd Park. In 1942, Iscoyd Park was requisitioned by the military, and building was started for an American hospital under Operation Bolero. When Operation Overlord started, it was decided to use the Bolero sites for their intended purposes, but the hospital sites would be used for the casualties from D-Day. The 82nd U.S. Army General Hospital Unit from Oregon was assigned to the site. On the 28th of February 1944, the unit sailed from Boston, arriving at Liverpool on the 11th of March. From Liverpool, they went to Llandudno, a staging area for American hospital units. This aerial photo shows the size and scale of the 82nd General Hospital at Iscoyd Park. On the 20th of March, an advance party of 3 officers and 40 enlisted men was sent to Iscoyd to prepare for the unit's arrival. On the 28th of March, the rest of the 82nd took a 4-hour train ride to Whitchurch before being driven to Iscoyd. On the 31st of March, the site was fully transferred from British Army to American control. The site was 90% complete, with the rest aimed to be finished within 21 days. The official opening of the hospital was meant to be at midnight the night before, the 29th of April 1944. However, the first admission was actually on the 27th of April 1944. From the 27th of September 1944, Iscoyd also began giving aid to injured German prisoners of war. They were given normal rations including cigarettes, something that the American troops were being denied at the time. Treatment of the prisoners of war included 202 blood transfusions, 18,000 hours of physiotherapy, 2,421 x-rays, 9 colostomies, 1 arterial aneurysm fixed surgically, 9 eye nucleations, 19 major operations, 627 minor procedures, and 815 plaster casts. There were only 9 deaths amongst the German prisoners of war. This photo, also taken at Mulper Station, shows injured German prisoners of war being transferred from a hospital train to a bus. Here is the admission figures for 1944. From the day the hospital opened in April to the 30th of September, there were 3,764 admissions. The 6th of October there were 603 admissions, and the week finishing the 13th of October there was 259 admissions. Then there is a small number of admissions each week up until the 8th of December, when there are 454 admissions, and then the 22nd of December when there are 319 admissions. The hospital wasn't completely safe. At 6 a.m. on the 24th of December, an air raid alert was placed on the site. 4 or 5 V-1 bombs struck to the north, east and south of the site, but the site suffered no actual damage. In 1945, from the 1st of January to VE Day, there were 3,940 admissions. On the 23rd of May, At 2400 hours, after 394 days of operating, the hospital was closed by the Americans and the site was handed back to the British. The 82nd General Hospital Unit was transferring to France. The total admissions were Allied 8,157 and enemy patients 2,793. The site used 792 tons of coal and 534 tons of coke. The site, however, wasn't immediately returned to the Godsill family. It kept its international activity going after the Americans left. Penly and Clannock-Panna. Here is a map showing the hospitals at Penly and Clannock-Panna. There was the 129th General Hospital in Penly at the top of the map, and the 83rd General Hospital in Clannock-Panna at the bottom of the map. At Penly Hall there was the 16th General Hospital, which was an experimental tented hospital designed to be used closer to the front lines. There were 4 main hospitals in Penly, but information on them isn't as easily available. More information is available on the 83rd General Hospital due to veterans' testimonies, but official information is scant. Major James Gordon of the 561st Field Artillery Battalion, stationed at Doddington near Nantwich, recalled his friend Major Melvin Chestnut, who he took to the 83rd on the 17th of April 1944. The next day he was operated on for a ruptured appendix. Major Gordon takes this as a sign that his unit's doctor is a poor diagnostician. On the 30th of April, Major Gordon cycled from Nantwich to Whitchurch to go to a church service before cycling to Penly to see Chestnut. On the 6th of May, Major Gordon deposited the unit's funds in a bank at Nantwich, before getting beans on toast for breakfast in Whitchurch. He collected the officers' pay at a bank in Wem, and then cycled to Penly to see Chestnut. He also saw the remains of a mosquito crash at the 16th General Hospital at Penly Hall. It was buried 20 feet deep after hitting a fog bank and losing control. The pilot stayed in the plane but made the navigator bail out. Chestnut was moved to a different hospital in mid-May and rejoined the unit in June. On the 11th of June, Sergeant Barrios was admitted to the 83rd General Hospital after suffering shrapnel wounds to his ankle. Confined to a wheelchair, he was going crazy with boredom, so a British nurse taught him to paint. He was commissioned to paint the NCO's club and painted a nude lady on the ceiling. It was well received until a chaplain saw it and said that if it wasn't given coverage, he'd push for closure of the club. Sergeant Barrios reluctantly painted on some veils over the offending areas and was subsequently commissioned to paint the hospital cinema's walls and ceiling. When his unit was about to invade Holland, he was allowed back on light duties, but on arrival at his unit's camp, he jumped out of the truck and reopened the wound on his ankle, putting him straight back in hospital, much to his sadness. Polish activity. In 1940, Russia deported thousands of Polish families from eastern Poland to labor camps in Siberia. In 1941, the Germans attacked the Russians, and the Russians subsequently joined the Allies. This allowed an amnesty for the detained Poles to form the Second Corps of the Polish Army. After the war, these Poles couldn't return home, and a solution was needed. The British government handed over disused sites such as American hospitals and old airfields for Polish usage. In August 1946, a Polish hospital unit was transferred from Italy to Penly. Iskoid became the isolation hospital for infectious Polish patients and continued to operate until 1956, when it was returned to the Godsill family. Penly and Clannock-Panna were the main general hospitals. The site also housed the staff for the hospitals. Tilstock became a Polish resettlement camp, housing the families of the patients. In 1947, the hospitals were transferred to the Ministry of Pensions and changed from Polish soldiers only to Polish families. Penly was the number 3 Polish hospital, Clannock-Panna was the number 11 Polish hospital, and Iskoid Park was the number 4 Polish hospital. Klanek Pana closed in the early 1950s, and the staff and patients were transferred up to the number 3 at Penly. In 1948, 803 Poles were treated for pulmonary tuberculosis at Iskoid, and 55 of them died. In November, it had about 400 current patients. Also in 1948, a Polish hospital at Gallow Hill, Morpeth, Northumberland, was closed, and the staff and patients were transferred to Penly. Sadly, there are 180 Polish graves at St Mary's Church in Penly, with about 60 of them being for infants. There are also at least 53 Polish graves at Whitchurch Cemetery, connected to the hospital at Iskoid. One of the men who died at the Polish Isolation Hospital at Iskoid Park was General Brigadier Roman Gorecki. He is buried at Whitchurch Cemetery. After the war, the families of Polish soldiers started arriving and needed housing. Upon arrival, they would go to a transit camp such as Daglingworth near Cirencester. From there, they would be assigned to coaches going to the actual long-term camps. There was some leeway in assignments, and you could ask the commandant to be moved within reason. Tilstock was a family camp near Penly and Iskoid, and so patients' families wanted to go there. South of the runways at RAF Tilstock was turned into a family camp. It was split into different campsites. Each site had several huts for living in and communal facilities, so it was essentially similar to a very small street. There are at least 21 sites on Tilstock. On one of these sites there was a communal entertainment hut, and on another there was a church. Children were told to stay on their own sites, but adults would have friends on other sites. In the late 1950s, some council houses were built on what would have been Site 21, Manor House Lane, for the Polish families. The adults would go to work, and the children would be looked after on their sites. The children attended local schools during the week and a Polish school on Saturday mornings. Every Sunday they would all go to the church run by Father Piotr Paweł Niemera, a survivor of Dachau. There were big Corpus Christi processions and a summer Kermas. Air crashes in Whitchurch. There were several air crashes in the Whitchurch area. I'm going to look at 2 of them that actually happened in the town. On the 14th of May 1944, Flight Sergeant Kennedy from New Zealand performed a slow roll over Whitchurch. Unfortunately, this caused his engine to cut out, forcing him to do an emergency landing of his British Master EM391 trainer on Alkington Road. The other crash involved 2 planes, a car, and someone on the ground. It also resulted in a crash report by the Royal Australian Air Force. On the 14th of January 1943, 2 planes took off from RAF Hawarden on separate low-flying training missions. Both planes were North American Mustang Mark Is. The first was flown by Pilot Officer Rex Raphael Heathcott, took off at 2:15 headed for Wem, and the second, flown by Pilot Officer Richard Beavers, took off at 2:25 headed for Whitchurch. At 3:10, the planes collided in mid-air just south of Whitchurch Station. The eyewitness reports from pilots at RAF Whitchurch Heath state that they saw the planes weaving before losing sight of them. Another eyewitness was Lance Corporal Harold Rolfe, who was at home on leave. He saw the planes at 100 feet, lower than their minimum altitude of 200 feet, chasing each other. The front plane turned sharply, and the second plane couldn't react in time and clipped the tail. The leading aircraft fell immediately, while the second carried on a short distance before crashing. When the crash occurred, a Browning 50mm cannon fell from one of them and smashed through the roof of W. H. Ashley's garage at Weymills. It crushed the hearse that was in the garage and injured a Mrs. D. McClellan from Ash, who was also in the garage. She was rushed to the cottage hospital, where she was seen by Dr. Livingstone. He diagnosed a fracture to the base of her skull. A week after the crash, Dr. Livingstone denied the crash inspector from interviewing her and stated he was unsure if she'd recover, as she was gravely ill. I believe Mrs. D. McClellan was actually Mr. David T. McClellan's wife. He died in Whitchurch in 1958, and she was originally called Jane Gorstage Leake and was born in Whitchurch. If it is Jane Gorstage McClellan, she survived until she was 88 years old and died in Newport in 1970. The crash report puts the crash down to pilot error. This image shows a Browning 50mm machine gun which was fitted to aircraft. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you have any queries about the video or the history of Whitchurch, Shropshire, please email us at the museum and we'll get back to you. Thanks.